Welcome. This is the last lecture for Unit 5. This is the discussion about the art impulse. And for this unit, since we were talking about the Renaissance, and we were looking at not only a lot of religious art, but for the first time, a lot of religious art that was of our predominant religion, of Christianity. So felt like a good time to talk about the relationship between art and religion. So the piety impulse is about a couple of things. One of the things it's about is the different things that people have wanted to do with art. That people, in terms of explaining religion, they want art to tell religious narratives. They often will want the art to be a representation of the divine itself. Sometimes they also want the art to be a representation of piety or of faithfulness or of religious experience. And also, people many times have wanted their art to be a source of religious experience, a means of creating religious experience. And sometimes art is actually a detailed explanation of theology, and all of those things. But some of the, I say up at the top, the main things to remember is that that there is lots of non-Christian religions out there, and we've seen a lot of non-Christian art already, and that also religious experience can be very institutional, can be very normative, but it can also be very personal, idiosyncratic, or non-doctrinaire. Okay, so as I said, we were looking at Renaissance art, and we were seeing religious art, like these two works right here. So it's a good time to think about what these kind of works are doing and what they're saying. And in this case, we have a religious description of an event, right? So it's a religious narrative, and then the narrative is an important part of theology, right? The whole passion sequence of Jesus is a central core to the theology of Christianity. So it is both a religious story with religious moral import, but it's also a description of theology as well. Whereas this painting is much more just a description of theology about the placement of, or kind of the structure of heaven, right? It is a scene of Madonna enthroned in heaven with Christ seated on her knee. So one of the points I want to make kind of early on is remember that a lot of the art that we have seen, almost all of the art that we have seen in this class up to this point, has been religious art. There's been a lot of religious art. We tend maybe not to notice so much when it's not our religion, but this is religious art. It's also political art, but it's religious art. This is religious art. Stonehenge is religious art. And even something like this, we tend to look at this and we see it from the point of view of what the Greek mythology means to us, which is cool stories about battles and about heroes. And that's what it was to the Greeks as well, but it was also part of their religion, and it's important to remember that. So now, as I said, one of the main things that art can do is it can tell stories, just like we talked about in the narrative lecture, and it can tell stories that are central to the religion. And sometimes there are stories that are central to the religion because they are literally tied to the fundamental theology of the religion, right? And so, like the Passion narrative is like the perfect example of that, right? Christianity doesn't exist without the Passion narrative. It doesn't make any sense without it. But it is also a gripping story in of itself. Whereas this particular scene out of the whole story of the Iliad and the Iliad in general is a narrative that's part of the religion of Greek piety of the time, but it's not central to it in the same way. But it is central to the idea of what it means to be Greek. So it's central to their sense of cultural identity. But also keep in mind that for most people in the world, the difference between being central to your faith and being central to your culture identity is kind of a non-issue. We live in a modern age where we see those two things as separate things. Here's another way of thinking about religious art. you could think about both of these two images as a representation of the divine, as an imagining of what the divine is about, and what it's like, right? This is, in some ways, it's a house, it's a temple and a house for the divine, right? For Athena Parthenos specifically. But in other ways, it's much more than that. As a temple in general, as the prime temple at the top of the Acropolis, it becomes also a symbol in general of all of the Greek ideals, of the whole Greek religiosity and Greek philosophy is embodied in this structure. And in some ways also, this figurine is not simply just a representation of the divine on a simple literal level of it's a representation of the desire for fertility in the world, and that everything needs to be fertile to grow, but it's also a love of just creation itself. So here's another way of thinking about how narrative and images of the divine are presented. We have two examples of the Passion story, and they show very different ways of thinking about it, right? When you discuss the Passion story, do you focus just on the crucifixion, or do you discuss the moments before the crucifixion? Do you see it from the point of view of the people who were there, or do you see it from the point of view of religious experience today? Right, in that case, today being 965 CE. Do you see it as somewhat as a historical event, or do you see it as purely a theological and religious event? Here are three different crucifixions, each one showing very different ideas about what were the important things in the crucifixion. We don't take a whole lot of time to discuss all of them, but it's important to kind of see some of the differences. One of the main differences I would say is, notice how in the Max Beckmann, how he's really focusing on the rigor mortis of the body, how being faithful to that reality, the reality of Jesus truly being dead at the point that he was taken down from the cross, was really important to him. Whereas in the Rubens, the body doesn't really seem dead. It's like this super relaxed. So he's almost to the point of heresy, allowing the body to not appear dead so that he can get at maybe a greater truth, which is the life after, right? The eternal life that comes after the crucifixion. Whereas in Eakins, he was trying to make a painting that is as truthful to the actual physical moment of being up on a cross. He literally had a model hang on the cross for hours each day, which apparently is really gruesome. You could, I did not realize this until I saw a video on it, but you could actually kill someone by just tying their arms and keeping their arms up above their head for that long. And so, but apparently Eakins didn't kill his model, but nonetheless, this painting is all about the physical reality of what it must be like to be hanging on a cross. So each one took a very different kind of approach. Another approach to showing religious ideas is to focus on the saints. One of the values of, let's say, focusing on the saints is that you can both deal with the idea of piety. You can represent what is good model, good models for religious living and good living, right? By focusing on saints, and at the same time avoiding having to, and then you can also demonstrate, story at the same time. Sometimes artists focus on actually trying to depict the religious experience itself. We've already looked at St. Francis in Ecstasy here, and actually I think we've seen both of these works. And both of them in very different kind of ways are trying to represent the experience of connecting with the divine. Obviously Bernini is taking a much more physical, almost erotic approach to what that must be like, but both of them are focusing on that experience. I think this is a good point to end, and I'll get to the last part in just a second.